Lead us, evolution, lead us up the future's endless stair. Chop us, change us, prod us, weed us, for stagnation is despair. Groping, guessing, yet progressing, lead us, nobody knows where. Wrong or justice, joy or sorrow, in the present, what are they? While there's always jam tomorrow, while we tread the onward way. Never knowing where we're going, we can never go astray. That's one of my favorite lines. To whatever variation our posterity may turn, hairy, squashy, or crustacean, bulbous-eyed or square of stern, tusked or toothless, mild or ruthless, towards that unknown God we yearn. Ask not if it's God or devil, brethren, lest your words imply static norms of good and evil, as in Plato, throned on high. Such scholastic, inelastic, abstract yardsticks we deny. Again, that's such a good line. That the use of, he's just so good. Plato, if you're unfamiliar with Plato, Plato teaches, Plato's a Greek philosopher who exists hundreds of years before Christ walks the earth. Plato, though, believes in these ideals, that there are, maybe you've heard of the phrase Platonic forms, that there is a God, and in the mind of that God, there are these forms that represent ideals like justice, goodness, evil, so on and so forth. And so you are a good man to the degree that you correspond with God's idea of good. So there are these abstract forms to which you correspond to. You're brave to the degree that you correspond with the ideal of bravery. And those ideals are not just created by culture. They are binding and authoritative across all human beings, across all time. So in the satirical poem here, he's saying evolution shows us that we deny those forms. We're not concerned about what the next thing we're progressing into is going to be, a god or a devil, because if you talk that way, if you're concerned about, we may turn into bad people, well, then your words imply static norms of good and evil, as in Plato, throned on high, and such scholastic referring to like the period in church history of scholasticism, which is like the post-Renaissance era, where there was a big recovery. Think of like the time of Thomas Aquinas. There was a big recovery in the church of Aristotle and Plato. They reappropriated these ideas. So that's such scholastic, inelastic, abstract yardsticks we deny. Far too long have sages vainly glossed great nature's simple text. He who runs can read it plainly. Goodness equals what comes next. So forget Plato. Forget the idea that God tells you what's good. Evolution teaches us that what's good is what comes next. It's what has survival value. It's what moves us forward. We are progressing. By evolving, life is solving all the questions we perplexed. On then, value means survival value. If our progeny spreads and spawns and licks each rival, that will prove its deity. Far from pleasant by our present standards, though it may well be. Lewis is a really good poet, and this is just a fun poem. Such scholastic, inelastic, abstract yardsticks we deny, never knowing where we're going, we can never go astray. That's clever, but there's a lot of good truth in that. And this poem contains a lot of what the Abolition of Man is trying to show you, the danger. When you try to base values like justice and virtue and goodness, when you try to base those exclusively in the material realm, those are just subjective emotions that you feel. And you define justice one way, I define it a different way. Who's to tell us what's what? If we do that, then we get rid of these abstract yardsticks that we need to have in order to say one person's view is wrong and one person's view is right. Not just one person's view I prefer and another person's I don't prefer. And that's what Lewis is trying to get at with the lectures he is giving in the Abolition of Man. All right, so let's do a brief overview of Chapter 1. So far we have covered Chapter 1, which was titled Men Without Chests, and this is the opening lecture that he gives. These are the Riddle Memorial Lectures he's giving, the 3 lectures he's given to a group of academics. And in the first lecture, he talks about the danger of subjectivism in values. He's arguing that value judgments are objective. They are either right or wrong, even if our feelings about them are incorrect. So if you say that you feel like a husband being faithful to his wife is a good thing, but I say I don't feel that. I think monogamy is a societal construct that, was useful at one point maybe, but now, because we have birth control and, there's so many other things, now we don't need it. And so you feel that way, I don't feel that way. And Lewis is saying just because I don't feel that way about monogamy, it does not mean that monogamy is just this Play-Doh that we can shape how we want in our hands. There are things that are right and are wrong, regardless of how we feel about them. And what we need to do is we need to shape our feelings with those objective values. And these objective value judgments are recorded in every major religion and philosophy across time. This is what he refers to just as the Tao. Now, he's going to expand on this more. He's going to show, particularly in Chapter 2, how there can be differences in what the Tao looks like in each culture, in each religion. Different religions teach different things as far as ethics come. He is going to say that if you were to take all of the world religions and all of the major philosophies, and you were to boil down their ethical teaching, so not their strictly theological teaching about the nature of God or the afterlife or salvation, but their purely ethical teaching about how we ought to treat one another, Lewis is going to claim that there's much more similarity than there is difference. In general, most ethical systems teach something like, treat other people the way you want to be treated, don't lie, don't steal, be faithful to your promises, don't be a coward, things like that. And so that's all he's referring to isn't necessarily the content of all of the different iterations of the Tao. Rather, he's saying that the Tao is this general impulse and intuition that all human beings have towards moral obligation. We ought to live life a certain way, and there are really right and wrong ways to live. That's the Tao. And the danger is that we create clever but morally bankrupt children when we treat the Tao as nothing but subjective emotions that can be dispensed with. And he's fearful that we are creating the next generation of children as men without chests. And chests is and remember his analogy, the head, which represents your rational mind, your intellect, your belly, which represents your passions, and then you have your chest, which represents just sentiments, your values, your deep-seated beliefs about right and wrong and truth and goodness and beauty. And the rational mind rules the passionate man through these values. But if our education of the next generation is reduced to only teaching them about science and mathematics and computer coding or whatever, but we don't teach them to love what is true, good, and beautiful, then we create clever but morally impotent individuals, men without chests. That's Chapter 1. Which brings us to Chapter 2, called The Way. And here's the first sentence of that chapter. The practical result of the education in the spirit of the Green Book, remember that's the book he's criticizing in Chapter 1, must be the destruction of the society which accepts it. which is a very alarming statement. The destruction of a society that accepts it. He's writing this in 1943 in England, and he's saying that this perspective is endemic in the education of children. Now, we could debate whether or not England has been destroyed as a society. I mean, actually, maybe you could. But he moves on, actually. He says it has not come to that yet. No, he's going to go on now. This chapter is not going to deal with how the abolition of men without chest. He's not going to get into how that leads to the destruction of a society. That's going to be the third chapter. In the third chapter, he's going to show you the degree to the kind of destruction that he means. And it is far worse than anything that's taken place thus far. But right now he's going to stop and he's going to say there are theoretical difficulties in the philosophy of Gaius and Titius, the authors of the Green Book. Remember that those men are two men named King and Ketley. Their book is called The Control of Language. And he's saying that in their own philosophy there's actually problems that they have. Here's what he says. However subjective they may be about some traditional values, Gaius and Titius have shown by the very act of writing the Green Book that there must be some other values about which they are not subjective at all. They write in order to produce certain states of mind in the rising generation, if not because they think those states of mind intrinsically just or good, yet certainly because they think them to be the means of some state of society which they regard as desirable. You see what he's getting at? King and Ketley, Gaius and Titius, they are saying, on the one hand, there is no universal values. Every moral statement that you make is you simply expressing your own subjective preferences, your own emotional state. Yet, Lewis says, if that's true, why are you writing this book then? Why are you trying to convince the next generation that your perspective is the correct perspective? The important point is not the precise nature of their end, but the fact that they have an end at all. They must have, or their book, being purely practical in intention, is written to no purpose. And the end that they have must have real value in their eyes. Gaius and Titius, who are saying there is no such thing as good, capital G, good, like Plato. Yet, they seem to believe that their perspective is itself good. So, in a much simpler way, I was reminded, when I was like 15, I got really into like moody, emo music. This was, I don't know if emo is the right word for it, but a band I really liked was called Bright Eyes. And they wrote this really nihilistic, depressing song called We Are Nowhere and It's Now, which I loved. I thought it was really cool. But they have this line in here that actually is a great summary. They say, if you say that there's no truth, then who cares? How come you say it like you're right? Well, that's a very simple response, but that's a hard hook to get off of once you're pierced with it. If, Gaius and Titius, if you say there is no good thing, but it is far better for you to believe what I say, well, hang on. I thought you just said that everything was subjective. That's just your interpretation. That's just your experience. I can reply back to that just as simply as saying, well, I don't agree. Now, the Green Book, Lewis goes on, could reply. This isn't Lewis. This is me summarizing what Lewis is saying. The Green Book could reply, well, hang on. No. We aren't making this argument because it's good or virtuous like Plato or a Christian would. That's not what we're saying. Rather, we're just saying this book's necessary. It's progressive. As in, it's moving us. It's just moving the conversation forward. It's not capital T true, but we're just pointing out some problems. It's effective. All the traditional values, they could claim, clog our society with superstition and false dogma. So you church people who believe in 10 Commandments and whatnot, like you look at what the damage that's done to our society. Superstitions and fear that people have. We're not trying to advance something as a replacement to religion. We're just trying to point out what's wrong. That could be their reply. And here's Lewis's reply to them. To abstain from calling it, that is their argument in the book, good, and to use instead such predicates or titles as necessary or progressive or efficient would be subterfuge, a trick. They could be forced by argument to answer the questions, necessary for what? Progressing towards what? Effecting what? In the last resort, they would have to admit that some state of affairs was, in their opinion, good for its own sake. And, he goes on, this time they could not maintain that good simply described their own emotion about it. If you're trying to say there is no such thing as good, that's just all something that we created, but please buy my book. Because, you boil their argument down saying, if everyone buys my book and reads it, society will be better. What do you mean by better? They would be forced, and C.S. Lewis would pin them to the ground, they would be forced to admit there is a conception they have of good that they believe is absolutely true and absolutely universally applicable. Everyone should listen to them, even as the very argument of their book is claiming to debunk the very idea and concept of universal good. If you claim that there's no truth, then who cares? Why do you say it like you're right? In actual fact, Gaius and Titius will be found to hold with complete, uncritical dogmatism the whole system of values, which happened to be in vogue among moderately educated young men of the professional classes during the period between the two wars. People who deny the idea of traditional value, traditional dogma, they just accept another dogma. They accept another one. Right? So Lewis is, this is maybe like a little condescending for Lewis to say this, right? But he's just saying, I know what your dogma is. What was cool when you were in college? What made you want to fit in? What's this view, right? And so you're being so, condescending towards me that my dogma comes from the tradition of my church. Yours just came from the conversation you had in a pub with your friends. Their skepticism about values is on the surface. It is for use on other people's values. About the values current in their own set, they are not nearly skeptical enough. And this phenomenon is very usual. A great many of those who debunk traditional, or as they would say, sentimental values, have in the background values of their own which they believe to be immune from the debunking process. They claim to be cutting away the parasitic growth of emotion, religious sanction, and inherited taboos in order that the real or basic values may emerge. But so this is Lewis when he says there's theoretical problems with Gaius and Titius's philosophy. So before he even deals with how it's going to destroy society, he's willing to point out that you are just as dogmatic and dependent on faith as any other Christian or any other religious person is. It's the same thing that you have going on here. Your skepticism is skepticism that you only use on other people, but about your own values, you're not skeptical enough. You haven't learned to use doubt on yourself. And they think that by cutting away traditional value and whatnot, they're reducing society back down to what really matters. Right? So again, take the position of someone who is convinced that every value and moral system we have has really been given to us through the process of evolution. And this is a very common view. Biological evolution gave us the values that we have. Why are we concerned about taking care of our family or honoring your parents or staying true to your promises? Well, they would say, evolution showed us that, the families and herds that had this kind of instinct to care for one another, and, if you said something and you stayed true to your word, well, you were selected. Survival value. Goodness equals what comes next. And so, evolution also granted to those tribes of hominids or whatever that survived this kind of superstition around the importance of telling the truth. Honor your father and mother. We begin to associate religious significance to that. And so that's what religion just came as this kind of mechanism of superstition that helped human beings survive. And so, you don't go near that volcano because the devil lives there. Because, the last, monkey that climbed up the volcano and fell in and died, everyone said, oh, I don't want that to happen to me. And so now if we tell everyone else the gods are angry if you go up there, the monkeys survive. So that's the idea. And so now, people living in the 20th century, in Lewis's time, they're smart enough, they realize the trick of what evolution was doing. And so we no longer need the mysticism and superstition of the past. We are like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, who found out that there is no wizard. It's just a man behind the curtain. And that's the trick. You see through it. And so they're debunkers. They see through this stigma and dogma to what is really happening. And so now we can make society. Now we know how the game works. We can make society into what we want. Right? That's the idea. But Lewis says, okay, I see your argument. Let's now, aside from the theoretical difficulties, which he's already kind of he's skewered, it's impossible for you to argue this way. The most consistent thing to do if you are truly a subjectivist is to not try to persuade anyone of any opinion. But he has something called the experimentum crucis, or the crucial experiment. And this is what he brings up, what he brought up in the first chapter, and that's the dulce et decorum est. What is it that is going to lead someone to be willing to die for a good cause? And this is what he thinks. He thinks that this is the experimentum crucis, not because being willing to die for a good cause is the sum total of being a moral person, but it is the greatest testing point. It's the greatest experiment about where values really come from and what will actually produce durable values. That's his idea. So he asks, why should, and this isn't him, these are my words actually, why should, without any reference to the Tao, one person risk their life for the sake of another or their country? Why would that be good? So, let us suppose that an innovator, so now this is the title that Lewis gives to people like Gaius and Titius, who are not only debunking, but they're trying to set forward a wholly new system of values without reference to the Tao. Let us suppose that an innovator in values regards dulce et decorum est, that's not supposed to be set, but est, and greater love hath no man, as mere irrational statements, which are to be stripped off in order that we may get down to the realistic or basic ground of this value. Where will he find such ground? If you're relying on evolution, okay, what's the evolutionary value of someone being willing to die for others? And I thought actually it'd be good to consider like a real example that's connects with us. I realize these lectures are pretty heady, so throw in something to connect with us. Most of you can remember where you were when 9/11 happened, right? Do you guys remember, are you familiar with the story of Rick Rescorla? Rick Rescorla was a security officer who worked in the two towers. He was in the South Tower, the tower that was hit second. When the first tower was hit, He worked for Goldman Sachs, or no, Morgan Stanley. And there was, when the first tower was hit, this huge, a voice over the speakers told everyone in the second tower to just stay at their desks. Because they were afraid of a stampede or something like that. But Rick knew that that was stupid. And so he grabbed a megaphone and he went through all of the floors that he worked on, and he shouted at people through the megaphone to leave, to get down, and he directed them to the stairs. He even sang songs to calm them down as they went. And he got 2,700 Morgan Stanley employees out of the tower before it collapsed. But as everyone got out, and he's sitting there, and I'm not going to share this because it'll be too emotionally manipulative, honestly, but he has a phone call with his wife, and he tells his wife, I love you, and it's very moving. He gets everyone out, he comes down, and then he turns around and goes back into the tower, and another employee tells him, you need to leave because this tower's been hit at this point. Don't go back in there. And he says, as soon as I make sure everyone else is out, I'll leave. He runs back in, gets a couple stories up, tower collapse, and he dies. Now, okay, what would possibly compel a person to do that? Well, Lewis tries to take the innovator's argument and consider what they might say. The first argument is that they might use utility, or the ethical system of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the ethical system that says goodness equals what brings about the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. Badness, evil, is just the opposite of that. What creates the greatest amount of harm for the greatest amount of people. So you can make ethical decisions on these purely utilitarian basis. So, something's not just inherently right or inherently wrong. Each decision is situational, based on what's going to make the most people happy or what's going to give the most harm to people. So here's what Lewis says. First of all, the innovator might say that real value lay in the utility of such sacrifice to the community. Good, he might say, means what is useful to the community. But of course, the death of the community is not useful to the community. Only the death of some of its members. What is really meant is the death of some men is useful to other men. That is very true. But on what ground are some men being asked to die for the benefit of others? Every appeal to pride, honor, shame, or love is excluded by hypothesis. Pride, honor, shame, love, those are appeals to the Tao. So when Rick Rescorla runs back in, maybe he's compelled by pride, honor, he would be ashamed were he not to, or maybe just a deep love for his fellow man, a sense of duty. But all of those things come from the Tao. To use these would be to return to sentiment. And the innovator's task is, having cut all that away, to explain men in terms of pure reasoning, why they will be well advised to die, that others may live. He may say, unless some of us risk death, all of us are certain to die. Well, that will be true only in a limited number of cases. And even when it is true, it provokes the very reasonable counter-question, why should I be one of those who takes the risk? This will preserve society, cannot lead to do this, except by the mediation of society ought to be preserved. The innovator is trying to get a conclusion in the imperative mood, which is a command, out of premises in the indicative mood. This is just a statement of fact. And though he continues trying to all eternity, he cannot succeed, for the thing is impossible. All right, so we're all in this room. Someone throws a grenade into the room. And we all know if that grenade goes off, everyone will die. But if one of us lays on that grenade, they will die, but everyone else will be saved. And so a utilitarian would say, it is a good thing for you to lay on that grenade because that will create the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. Cool. Exactly. But why ought I be the one? Do you see, it's an indicative statement. It is a good thing. Sure. It will preserve society. Sure. Why me though? Why do I have to run back into the tower? It doesn't work. So, Lewis goes on. Lewis is great at steel-manning an argument. Right? A straw man is you create an easy-to-defeat version of your opponent's argument, and you can beat it up, because straw men can't fight back. Steel-manning is when you create a strong version of your opponent's argument, and then you respond to that. And that's what Lewis does. So he moves on to a different argument, and that's of instinct, or evolution. The preservation of society and of the species itself, and then so now he's talking, this is Lewis's voice, but he's imagining that he's trying to defend why ought should society be preserved? Why ought you throw yourself on the grenade? So he's talking from that perspective. This isn't his voice. This is him speaking for his opponent. The preservation of society and of the species itself are ends that do not hang on the precarious thread of reason. They are given by instinct. That is why there is no need to argue against the man who does not acknowledge them. We have an instinctive urge to preserve our own species. That's why men ought to work to posterity. So he's pointing out how do you go from, the grenade's in the room, someone needs to throw themselves on it, it would be good for someone to do it, yet you reach this point where there's no reason you provide for why ought you to do it. Because unless you appeal to the Tao, but you said no to that, why is there no reason? Okay, so then the person says, okay, well there is no reason because evolution just gave us this instinct, Why did Rick Rescorla run back into the tower? Okay, well evolution just created in him some sort of, it wasn't rational, it was just this gut. I gotta go do it. Okay, and so these people are saying that's not because there is this platonic ideal of courage or valor or heroism. It just was an instinct. And that's why we ought to do it. But, Lewis says, we have no instinctive urge to keep promises or to respect individual life. That's why scruples of justice and humanity, in fact the Tao itself, can be properly swept away when they conflict with our real end, the preservation of the species. That, again, is why the modern situation permits and demands a new sexual morality. The old taboos served some real purpose in helping to preserve the species, but contraceptives have modified this. We can now abandon many of the taboos. For, of course, sexual desire, being instinctive, is to be gratified whenever it does not conflict with the preservation of the species. Instincts don't lead us to be scrupulous in justice and mercy or keeping promises. We do have an instinctive drive to propagate the species. And by this, he's referring to our instinct of self-preservation. We have instincts to eat, to sleep, to drink, and to reproduce. That's the animal-like part of us. Like we just want to live, and we want to keep on living, and so we're drawn to those things. But now the innovator can say, you see, we don't need to be bound by the taboos of the past, which policed, for instance, sexual morality. Like, why did human beings have such strong feelings about monogamy for so long? Well, because pregnancy is a really dangerous thing, and your chances of survival go way up if you're in a relationship where you have a partner that stays with you and commits to you and helps provide care for that child. But if you have a contraceptive and you can take sex and peel it away from that, then that taboo that we have that's glommed onto us, like the way that snow kind of gloms onto a ball as it rolls down a hill, we don't need that anymore. That's the response. It looks, in fact, as if an ethics based on instinct will give the innovator all he wants and nothing that he does not want. You say, oh, brilliant. Right? It gives you a reason for why does the guy jump on the grenade? It's instincts led him to it. You don't have to explain it. But that instinct doesn't come with all of the baggage of like having to only have sex in marriage or go to church or, open the door for little old ladies. I don't want to do that. I see why I have that instinct because of how it helped the society progress in the past. We don't need that anymore. But Lewis's reply is twofold. First, he says, instinct is just a name for what we know not what. He says, when we say that birds know how to fly south by instinct, what we really mean is we don't really know why they fly south. They just do it by instinct. But secondly, more seriously, if instinct is this thing given to us that we must obey, you just feel the instinct and you must do it, and that's where our moral impulses come from, then why are books like the Green Book written? Why are they trying to convince us, if it is inevitable, that we simply obey instincts? He says, why this mood of exhortation? Why are you trying to convince me of your view if instinct is the great engine behind all of our morals and values? So, the innovator says, well, that's because if you obey your instincts, you will be happy. That's why why do you hold the door open for the little old lady? Okay, you have some instinct in you that tells you that, it makes you happy. Like, okay, fine, do it. It'll make you happy. But what about the experimentum crucis? What about when it comes to dying? The very question we are considering was that of facing death, which, so far as the innovator knows, cuts off every possible satisfaction. And if we have the instinctive desire for the good of posterity, then this desire, by the very nature of the case, can never be satisfied, since its aim is achieved, if at all, when we are dead. It looks very much as if the innovator would have to say, not that we must obey instinct, nor that it will satisfy us to do so, but that we ought to obey instinct. You ought to do it. Are you following his argument here? Yeah, this is a little thick. What is it that leads Rick Rescorla to run back into the tower? Well, if they're saying, he has this instinct, this kind of herd instinct maybe, to protect other people. Well, okay, but if the main reason that we ought to obey our instincts is that it will make us happy, well then he will not be happy by dying. He will cease to exist. And therefore, if we have some instinct that compels us to self-extinction, well then that ought to be the last thing that we obey. We actually should be terribly suspicious of our instincts. Yet, their argument is the reason we obey instincts is because they make us happy. Oh no, but now, hang on, we have instincts that are going to lead to our demise. What do we do? If the person is trying to defend why it would be a good thing to die for a good cause, they would be left simply to state, you just ought to do it. But why ought we to obey instinct? Is there another instinct of a higher order directing us to do so? And a third of a still higher order directing us to obey it? An infinite regress of instincts? This is presumably impossible, but nothing else will serve. You feel an instinct to run into the tower, and you could just ask, why? This is a good logical argument. And why? They're trying to get something out of the indicative mood in an imperative mood. They're trying to take someone saying it is a good thing for someone to lie on that grenade. They're trying to get from that to you ought to. Greater love hath no than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Okay, so this is Abolition of Man is okay.
Maybe he thought it was a chance of making it out alive?
The Rick Rescorla?
Yeah, I mean,
I have no idea. I mean,
I don't either, but it just comes in my mind that they're a little bit different.
Than the grenade. Yeah, because the grenade is
The grenade's an absolute,
That's true.
and the other one is not.
True. Well, maybe I should have picked a better illustration then. If you try to read The Abolition of Man and you're kind of discouraged at how difficult it is to follow, which again, I'm doing these classes because I'm trying to provide like a guide to help understand this argument. And I hope by the end of these lectures, I hope you realize how unbelievably applicable this is to this moment right now in our society.
Very, very much.
Well, just wait. It'll actually get even, especially with the advent of what's happening with AI. This is going to, the last chapter is going to push the accelerator even more. You'll think C.S. Lewis is alive right now and writing this right now. But
it already seems like it, even.
But if you are overwhelmed, you can go to Mere Christianity. And the first book of Mere Christianity is divided into different books. The first book is it's this very similar argument that he's making in The Abolition of Man. In Mere Christianity, he's using the same idea of natural law to defend why there must be a lawgiver. If we have this sense of moral obligation, that must come from somewhere. But there's the second chapter in the book is called Some Objections. And he anticipates people objecting to this idea of there being an absolute moral law. And so this is from Mere Christianity. Lewis says, supposing you hear a cry for help from a man in danger, you will probably feel two desires. One, a desire to give help due to your herd instinct. The other, a desire to keep out of danger due to the instinct of self-preservation. But you will find inside you, in addition to these two impulses, a third thing, which tells you that you ought to follow the impulse to help and suppress the impulse to run away. Now, this thing that judges between the two instincts, that decides which should be encouraged, cannot itself be either of them. You might as well say that the sheet of music which tells you at a given moment to play one note on the piano and not another is itself the notes of the keyboard. The moral law tells us the tune we have to play. Our instincts are merely the keys. When you see a person drowning and you know if I jump in to try to help them, there's a chance I might drown. And so there's something in you says, I should help. And then something else says, oh, I don't want to. And then Lewis says, there's another thing that says, you ought. Like if the grenade falls into the room, you ought to lay down your life. Because you know that love is no greater example than this, but to lay down your life for your friends. Returning to the abolition of man. Telling us to obey instinct is like telling us to obey people. Well, people say different things, and so do instincts. Our instincts are at war. If it is held that the instinct for preserving the species should always be obeyed at the expense of other instincts, whence do we derive this rule of precedence? The truth finally becomes apparent that neither in any operation with factual propositions nor in any appeal to instinct can the innovator find the basis for a system of values. All the practical principles behind the innovator's case for posterity or society or the species are there from time immemorial in the Tao, but they are nowhere else. You cannot reach them as conclusions. They are premises. It is self-evidently true that it is good for you to work for the good of your neighbor, to lay down your life for others, to work to preserve society. You ought to do that. Not because that's immediately clear through evolution or through instincts, but it is given to you by the lawgiver, the moral law. And then he concludes, he realizes that this statement about the Tao, about moral law, it's just an assertion. Like if you read the first 4 chapters of Mere Christianity, and he makes the argument for the existence of God based on the moral law, he just makes a point that we all know what it's like to, he uses the example of, if I give you a bit of my orange, and then later you have an orange, and I say, hey, I gave you some of mine, you should give me some of yours. Now, you might say, well, no, I don't want to do that. But you will understand that there's been some sort of like contract we have entered into where you may quarrel with me about why, when I gave you the orange, it doesn't obligate you in giving me some of your orange. You're like, oh, well, I didn't ask for the orange. You just gave it to me. And I really need this orange right now or something. You might quarrel about it, but you wouldn't look at me like, what are you talking about? I have no idea what you're saying. Why do you think I owe you something? Quarreling only happens when we all are aware that there is some sort of standard, some sort of rule. If we play soccer and I say, hey, that was out of bounds, and you say, what are you talking about? We can't play the game. Lewis, he just states that. And he doesn't, there's no defense. It's not like, oh, the reason why we all are aware of that is, scientifically we can prove X, sociologically we can do this, logically we can do this. He is saying it is a self-evident truth. But I think this is a very helpful sentence. If nothing is self-evident, then nothing can be proved. Similarly, if nothing is obligatory for its own sake, then nothing is obligatory at all. If you keep tunneling down, like, why does this exist? You have to find the causal explanation, right? Why does the earth exist as it does, right? And you can give lots of different explanations. You could say God created the earth. Or you could say, it's some billions of years ago, a rock hit another rock, and those rocks eventually turned into this. Cool. Then you just say, well, where did those rocks come from? Well, those rocks were hit by other rocks, and then you just keep asking that question, and then eventually you have to get down to something that is just self-evident. Something that has causal, existent power in of itself, which is what we would. This was Aristotle's idea. There must be an unmoved mover, which begins all movement in the world. So there must be something that is the metaphysical, concrete, upon which everything else stands. And if nothing is self-evident, then nothing could ever be, in the final conclusion, ever proved. Nor, if something is not obligatory for its own sake, then nothing is obligatory at all. If there's not something that just simply is true, then there's at no point can you finally obligate anyone to do anything. Jumping back into the channel of the argument of the book, if all of our moral values and statements are mere preferences and sentiments given to us through the process of evolution, then in the final conclusion, nothing is morally obligatory. You're not obligated to stay faithful to your vows, your promises, to do what's right or wrong. Or why would you? Those are all just the ephemera of evolution that has been given to you. That why ought you fall on the grenade? Okay, that's a lot. I'm going to stop it right there. That's all I got. That was 44 slides. That's the end. If you just keep consistently showing up to this, you'll basically have read the book by the end just by reading what we have here in the slides. Any questions at all on any of that?
I'm just surprised. This is so true of our current day.
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't always true. Like, people weren't always relativists.
So back in the Greco-Roman world, there were people who were skeptics. Oh goodness, names are slipping mine.
It's a modern problem.
It's postmodernism.
That's what kicked it in.
Yeah. There were people who were radical skeptics way back when, but they were very, very few and far between. Very, very few and far between.
What caused postmodernism?
Modernism.
And that's just the age of reason.
So I've always wanted to teach a crash course on philosophy at some point. I don't know if I'll ever do that because I probably won't do a very good job at it. But pre-modernism or antiquity or the classical world, if metaphysics, think of a cake, like a 3-tiered cake. Metaphysics is the science of what is, what exists. That's metaphysics. And so we would say metaphysics is the ground of being. Like what we just said earlier about take the rocks hit each other, the other rocks hit each other, other rocks hit each other. Eventually, you have to come down to some sort of metaphysical concrete. Where did everything start? And so in classic philosophy, you always begin with metaphysics. You begin with, God, the gods, the spirits, the energy, there was some sort of thing that just was. And then you moved from metaphysics to epistemology. Epistemology is the science of knowledge. It's how do you know what you know? We know what we know, according to antiquity and pre-modernism, based on what is. God has revealed. He has spoken. We're made in the image of God, and therefore our minds correspond to reality. We can understand and we can discern things. And then, based on epistemology, you then move up to the top of the cake, and that's ethics. How then should we live? In light of what is, and how we can know what is, that's how we know how we live. Modernity, which began in the 16 and 1700s with René Descartes, and it's the age of the Enlightenment. That was a point where epistemology replaced metaphysics. Think of Descartes' famous cogito phrase, "I think, therefore I am." René Descartes, he was actually a sincere Christian. He had the thought, how do I know what really exists? What if a demon is tricking me and all of the world around me is all just a dream? It's a hallucination. How do I know that anything is real? How do I even know that I'm real? But then he realized, well, hang on, who is this I? Well, I'm thinking and I'm doubting. Therefore, there must be someone named me, this I, this person that exists, who is doubting. Therefore, I must exist. I think, therefore, I am. But that becomes this. It's called the epistemological turn. This shift happens where that becomes kind of like the way things work, and it works out differently depending on these different schools. There are empiricists and rationalists, and then Kant kind of blends the two of them together. But what's universal to all of them is we no longer simply say God has created this world and we exist in it. Now we limit our assertions of what is based on our ability to know and to learn. Why am I confident that God exists? And Descartes eventually goes on to try to attempt to prove why God exists based off of that starting point. I think, therefore, I am. Empiricists try to make the argument based off of sense experience. Rationalists try to make the argument based off of just what you can think through, your mind to be true, and then Kant kind of does this whole other thing. But modernism creates the world that Lewis lives in, and that's what eventually creates logical positivism. It's this reality that, what we can know is really limited, actually. So the only statements that have any truth value, therefore, are statements that can be empirically verifiable or are logically true, like 2 + 2 makes 4, or water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Those are the only things that we can be really sure about what exists. But about whether or not God exists, or the afterlife, or even these ideas about values of truth and XYZ, we don't even know that those exist, because you can't see them. They're not necessarily logically provable the way a math problem is. How do we know they exist? And so postmodernism, which began in the 60s after World War II, just kind of takes modernity to its nth degree. It realizes that epistemology is so limited, it's so constrained, that actually we can't really know anything. Metaphysics doesn't exist anymore. And actually, ethics itself is, how do we even know how we're supposed to live? And so post-modernity is a reaction against where modernism takes us. And it leads to the view of nihilism, that there is no truth, there is no right, there is no wrong, there's just the willed power. That's all it is. Just big people with big guns doing what they want. And that sucks, and what are you going to do about it? And so we live at an interesting time. Postmodernism, starts in the 60s. In many ways, it's kind of petered out just because you can't live on that for very long. We hunger for the Tao. There must be truth and meaning. When you hear the story of Rick Rescorla running back into the tower, there's something in you that says, that's heroic. You're not just thinking like, what a chump. He was tricked. There's something in you that sings, that rises, that expands in your chest. And I think that we live at a unique time where there's a different shift, some sort of postmodernism, or metamodernism, something like that. I think that's where we're at. Okay, flight. Let me pray for us. Well, Father in heaven, we pray that you would sharpen our minds and our hearts. God, we thank you that your truth, your beautiful, glorious truth has been revealed to us, and we get to not only know it and defend it, but sing it, eat it, rejoice in it, bathe in it. God, as we go to worship you in church, we pray that you would do that. Lift our hearts up to you, and we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.